In the first half of the 19th century, the children of those who had fought the war for independence came of age. This generation inherited the American Revolution, and their choices would to a large degree shape its legacy.
If you begin to look at it as a very youthful nation, a lot of very young people, expanding, moving out west, thinking that there are enormous possibilities for what this country could become, and making that country through thousands of individual decisions that they make about where to live, to get married, children. The sense of possibility, I think, was stronger then than in almost any other period of American history since. The United States expanded at an absolutely phenomenal rate in this period. It's unimaginable in many ways. Let's say somebody was born in 1780 and lived, let's say, to be 80 years old. Now, when that person was born, there were 13 states still fighting for their independence. By the time that person dies, you're talking about California is a state, Texas is a state.
The term manifest destiny was not coined until 1845, but the idea that Americans had a right, even a moral obligation, to expand westward, spreading democracy and Christianity, had been driving settlers since the colonial era. A fascination with the untamed West, with its promise of wealth, escape, renewal, and adventure, tugged at the American consciousness long before and long after the 19th century.
For white Americans, the people who predominantly, not all of them, but predominantly landed on the East Coast, West is the place where you went to get the land. It's the place where new hope would come. It's the place where you went to get away from whatever it was that you were trying to get away from. So it's always represented in American history, sort of the future for us, for better or for worse. But it has been a very, very powerful grip, I think, on the American imagination, the West. That's where the sun sinks, and that's where new hope arises. As long as you've always got a place to pick up and move to, that can give you an excuse not to solve the problem that's sending you there in the first place. With slavery, the West was this place where it became more and more contentious. Every time a new state would come into the Union, is it going to be slave or is it going to be free? Eventually, that had to be dealt with through the Civil War. If you're moving into land already inhabited by Indians or by Spanish people, eventually you've got to come to grips with the fact that there are people there who already consider it their home. And so to a certain extent it helped us delay, and to a certain extent it meant the final reckoning was in many cases quite violent.
Here, perhaps, has been assembled more love of liberty, virtue, wisdom, and learning than on any other spot in America.
Thomas Jefferson's mountaintop estate reflects the broad range of his interests, from agriculture to Aristotle. The gardens of Monticello open onto an unbroken vista of the Shenandoah Mountains and beyond to the western horizon. Jefferson's political philosophy also inclined him to look to the West.
Jefferson, like many men of his period, believed that the only way you can get people to be virtuous is if they're independent. That is, if they're free from dependency upon other important men for jobs, for food, and for other kinds of things. And the best way to do that was to have enough land to farm for yourself.
And he saw the West as a breeding ground for freedom. He also saw it as a place, being fascinated by Indians as he was, as perhaps a space in which the clashes between the two cultures could eventually be worked out better than they had been worked out on the Atlantic shore. So for him, it was both a place of great fascination, but also a great place of opportunity for what he hoped would one day be an empire of liberty.
The Louisiana Purchase gave Jefferson the means to implement his vision of America as a nation of landowners.
Room enough for our descendants to the 1,000th and 1,000th generation.
Jefferson, by executive action, essentially acquires half a continent, the entire Midwestern part of the United States, from the Alleghenies to the Rocky Mountains, the heartland of America, the most fertile area for growing crops in the world. And he does this despite the fact that he regards the executive action as unconstitutional.
In 1804, Jefferson commissioned his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to lead an exploration of the unknown territory.
The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent.
The Lewis and Clark expedition begins in the mind of Thomas Jefferson, and that's a very complicated, very robust mind. He was interested in Lewis and Clark as emissaries of the United States to the Indian peoples who lived there, because he wanted to capture the trade with those Indians and to beat the British and the French and the Spanish in what was a great geopolitical chess match going on in the western half of North America. Most of all, he thought that there was this magical Northwest Passage that would be a trade route to China.
It's an illegal expedition, and it's an illegal expedition especially once it gets west of the Rockies, because that's all Spanish territory. But he describes it as a scientific and literary expedition. Part of that's true, and he has genuine scientific curiosity, but that is also a convenient cover. In modern terms, this would be like a CIA operation that is covert, that is bringing back news from foreign countries that is being acquired somewhat illegally. It's a great adventure story, to be sure. Jefferson always thought that the West should be a place where the mysteries of America continue to exist, and that this is, it's like sending people on a magical mystery tour.
Lewis instructed his co-commander, William Clark, to recruit a crew for the expedition.
Some good hunters, stout, healthy, unmarried men, accustomed to the woods and capable of bearing bodily fatigue in a pretty considerable degree.
The departure of the Corps of Discovery was a big event in St. Louis. The town's most prominent citizens, including its legendary founder, Auguste Chouteau, accompanied Lewis as far as St. Charles. There, he met up with Clark and their crew, and the locals gave them a festive send-off.
Dressy, polite people, and Roman Catholics passed the evening very agreeable, dancing with the French ladies, etc.
But the next day, as they headed up the treacherous Missouri River, they were on their own.
Current exceedingly strong. Boat against some drift and snags. This was a disagreeable and dangerous situation, particularly as immense trees were drifting down.
After traveling 6 months and 1,000 miles upriver, the Corps of Discovery spent their first winter in log huts beside the village of the Mandan Indians.
Without the Mandan Indians, they would not have survived a bitterly cold North Dakota winter, where it got to 45 degrees below zero, with wind chills making it even worse. The Mandans gave them corn to eat. They helped hunt buffalo with them. The Hidatsis, their neighbors, gave them instructions of what they should expect when they go farther west.
When spring came, the men packed up a variety of articles to be shipped back to St. Louis and from there to President Jefferson.
The bones and skeleton of a small burrowing
4
wolf.
buffalo robes,
some Ricaris tobacco
The skin
seed,
of a yellow bear,
an ear of
specimens of
Mandan
plants
corn,
numbered from 1 to
One tin box
67.
containing insects,
One
mice,
robe representing a battle between the Sioux and Ricaras against the
4
Minotaurs and
living
Mandans.
magpie,
one earthen pot, such as the Mandans
The horns of
manufacture.
2 black-tailed deer,
As they prepared to resume their journey west, not knowing when or if they would ever return, Lewis surveyed his small party with excitement.
I could but esteem this moment of my departure as among the most happy of my life. The party are in excellent health and spirits, zealously attached to the enterprise, and anxious to proceed. Not a whisper or murmur of discontent to be heard among them.
We think of Lewis and Clark sort of joined at the hip now in history, but it wasn't 2 guys on an outward bound experience in the West. They had a group of people with them. There were woodsmen from Kentucky. There was a black slave of William Clark's named York. There were 3 men who were the sons of Indian women and French Canadians. There was an Indian woman and her half-French, half-Indian son. It was an incredibly diverse group. They succeeded because they worked together.
In April of 1805, the Corps of Discovery departed the Mandan village and proceeded west into the wide, fertile valleys that would one day be Montana.
The whole face of the country was covered with herds of buffalo, elk, and antelopes. They are so gentle that we passed near them while feeding without appearing to excite any alarm among them. Walking on the shore this evening, I met with a buffalo calf, which attached itself to me and continued to follow close at my heels, until I embarked and left it.
Orphan calves were not the only animals to pursue the party. A group of 4 men out hunting quickly found themselves running for their lives after shooting a grizzly bear.
In an instant, this monster ran at them with open mouth. He pursued 2 of them so close that they were obliged to throw aside their guns and pouches and throw themselves into the river, although the bank was nearly 20 feet perpendicular.
As they proceeded on towards the headwaters of the Missouri, Sacagawea emerged as the group's primary guide. Though she had been kidnapped as a young girl, she was Shoshone and had once called this land home.
The Indian woman recognizes the country and assures us that this is the river on which her relations live.
Lewis counted on Sacagawea not only as a guide, but also as a mediator with the Shoshones.
When they were confronted by mountain after mountain after mountain after mountain, where mountains weren't supposed to exist, they needed horses in order to continue. And the tribe of people who had the horses turned out to be not only her tribe, but led by her brother. So arriving with the long-lost sister of the chief of the tribe makes negotiating for horses a lot easier. Also, as a translator, made communication a lot easier. With every tribe that Lewis and Clark met, they would try to explain where they're going, that they were going to this far western ocean. The Shoshone called it the stinking lake of illy-tasted waters, salt water. You know, they knew where it was, and they, in fact, wore ornaments that had come from the ocean, though they themselves had never been there. And they could say, well, the tribe a little bit farther west, they live on a big river, and it flows to that, and that's where you ought to go next.
On horseback, they proceeded on into the Bitterroot Mountains.
The most terrible mountains I ever beheld.
Through rain, hail, and snow, half-starved, eating their horses and even their candles in desperation.
I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Indeed, I was at one time fearful my feet would freeze in the thin moccasins which I wore. The party, very cold and much fatigued.
When at last they came to a navigable stream, they paused to dig out their own canoes. The stream widened out into the Snake River, which in turn fed into the mighty Columbia. And on November 7th, 1805,
Great joy! We are in view of the ocean, which we've been so long anxious to see. As far as my sight could be extended, the seas raging with immense waves, breaking with great force.
they had now crossed the continent. They're the first people, American citizens at least, to really fully understand how big this continent is and how hard it is to get across, and they were on the far side of it. So that's where homesickness first hit the core of discovery.
Oh, how horrible is the day. 17th rained all night. 18th frequent showers through the day. 20th rained all day without intermission. 21st rained all night. 22nd rain continued.
They were not very happy, and I think part of that attitude rubbed off on their attitude toward the Clatsop and Chinook Indians as well. They're ready to go home, and instead of everything being a new adventure, everything was now an obstacle between themselves and their homes, and the Indians were among those obstacles.
After 4 dreary months, the explorers began the journey home. By June of 1806, they were once again braving the Rocky Mountains and enjoying the hospitality of the local Indian peoples. Descending the Missouri back toward St. Louis, they at first seemed more like ghosts returning from the dead than heroes from a successful mission.
At 11 a.m., we met a Captain McClellan ascending in a large boat. This gentleman, an acquaintance of my friend Captain Lewis, was somewhat astonished to see us return and appeared rejoiced to meet us. This gentleman informed us that we had been long since given up by the people of the U.S. generally and almost forgotten. The President of the United States had yet hopes of us.
6 days later, they descended to the Mississippi and down to St. Louis.
We were met by all the village and received a hearty welcome from its inhabitants.
The next morning, Lewis composed a letter to President Jefferson.
It is with pleasure that I announce to you the safe arrival of myself and party. In obedience to your orders, we have penetrated the continent of North America to the Pacific Ocean.
I think one of the enduring lessons of them is that just like them, every time you wake up in the morning, you face an uncertain horizon. They didn't know if they were going to, we now know that they were going to make it out and back. They didn't know that each morning they got up. And the only way that they could cross a big wide continent at 14 miles a day was to put one foot in front of the other and just slog it on. And the most recurring phrase in their journals are 3 words: we proceeded on. And it became sort of like a mantra for them, I think. Every newspaper in America ran stories about their return, but they all make mention of the fact that they made it and they made it back safely. But there also is, Indians are said to be peaceful, that the climate on the West Coast was said to be mild, and that there are all these fur-bearing animals out there. Well, you put all those things together to a nation that's already turned its face to the West for a place of opportunity, good climate, friendly Indians, and a fur trapper's paradise. And that's like throwing, a match onto some gasoline. People were wanting to go west and take advantage of all those things. We can look back when Lewis and Clark were first going west and see these moments when a U.S. military operation lived in peace and harmony with Indian peoples, and when they helped one another through cold winters or to get across a barrier. And it does make us ask, as we should, could it have been different if we had done it that way for the rest of that 19th century?
Once there was not a white man in all this country. Then it all belonged to the red man, now made miserable by the white people, who are never satisfied but always encroaching on our land. The only way to stop this evil is for all the red men to unite in claiming a common right in the soil, as it was at first and should be now.
Tecumseh is one of the most remarkable people who ever appeared on the continent. What he does is organize an alliance that's far different from anything that people had seen before. What he argues is that Indians as Indians are going to resist, and that no tribe has the right to cede land without the consent of all Indian peoples.
The Native American movement that emerges is primarily a religious movement that starts with his brother, the Shawnee Prophet. Tecumseh takes this religious movement and transforms it into sort of a confederacy, an attempt to unite tribal people against the onrushing frontier.
They work through religion, they work through ideology. They start these intertribal villages, first at Greenville, later at Tippecanoe, in which warriors from all tribes come together. So this is no longer a tribal effort so much as a new pan-Indian effort organized around them. Furthermore, what he tries to do, and successfully, is bring the British back in to back this alliance so that once more Indian peoples, now in a new form, under the leadership of Tecumseh, can make a stand against the Americans.
Tecumseh is very much a threat to the United States. They never understand the prophet. They see him as sort of a religious kook. But Tecumseh is a very interesting person in that what the United States does not want is a united Indian front. They want to work on the Indian tribes piecemeal.
A handful of U.S. leaders, referred to as the War Hawks, also wanted to expand into British Canada. They exploited fears about Tecumseh and maritime grievances against the British to garner support for a conflict that would become known as the War of 1812.
This is the last time that tribal people will have outside help in standing against a European power or the United States. One can't really say that the British are allied with the Indians. They're fighting, but they're fighting for different things. The British are fighting to keep the Americans from invading Canada. Tecumseh and the Indians are fighting desperately to hold on to their lands in the Great Lakes region and in the South as well.
The real chance to set up a native state, a backing of a powerful empire behind it, comes in the War of 1812. And Tecumseh realizes that. Tecumseh realizes if he can get British help, what he will be able to do is carve out an Indian border state in between Canada and the United States. And the British are thinking seriously of doing this as a way to protect Canada, as a bar to further American expansion. And in the early fighting, it goes very well for them. And Indian peoples win significant battles, but again, they're warriors. They're not armies. You can win all these battles, but if your supplies are cut off, if the British can no longer supply you, if warriors have to go home to feed their family, then it doesn't matter how many times you defeat the Americans, there's always a new army. And when Tecumseh finds that the British are retreating not because they've been defeated, but because their supplies have been cut off on Lake Erie, and Tecumseh at that point knows it's over.
In October of 1813, Tecumseh was killed in battle. His British allies surrendered, leaving Tecumseh's warriors alone to continue the fighting. As they learned of his death, the Indian forces abandoned the field. His lifeless body was eventually seized by the victorious Americans and torn limb from limb.
After Tecumseh's death, the Indian Confederacy collapses. There will never be, after Tecumseh, a confederacy on the scale of the one that he put together, and any realistic hopes of Indian peoples carving out this special status of maintaining an independence between empires and republics, that's really gone. The War of 1812 is a critical war for Indian peoples. After that, their ability to negotiate between empire and republic is gone. And Americans will, after this, try to dictate to Indians. They no longer have to be appealed to them as allies. You no longer have to worry about them going over to another empire and helping them out. Those days are gone.
The decade after the War of 1812 was known as the Era of Good Feelings, because of the nationalistic euphoria that washed over the burgeoning country. But Western expansion also deepened regional and ideological differences as the new territories applied for admission to the Union as free states and slave states. The congressional debate over Missouri was especially fierce.
The Missouri subject monopolizes all our conversation, all our thoughts, and for 3 weeks at least to come, will all our time.
The controversy dragged on for 2 years. Southern representatives openly threatened disunion.
God has given us Missouri, and the devil shall not take it from us.
Missouri was finally admitted as a slave state, along with Maine as a free state, thus maintaining the balance between the North and the South. As part of the Missouri Compromise, a line was drawn the length of the 3630 parallel, below which slavery would be permitted, and above which slavery would be forever banned. In retirement at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson received the news of the Missouri Compromise with fear and dread.
This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened me in terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union, a geographical line held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper.